The morning fog was just beginning to lift from Norfolk Naval Base when Chief Petty Officer Martinez burst into our barracks, his face pale as winter frost. It was October 15th, 1962, and I was 22 years old, barely 2 years into my service, as an explosive ordnance disposal specialist. The Cuban Missile Crisis had everyone on edge, but nothing could have prepared me for what came next. Henderson, get your gear now. Martinez's voice cut through the usual morning chatter like a blade. The other sailors in the barracks fell silent, sensing the gravity in his tone. I'd been cleaning my diving equipment, the familiar routine of checking seals and testing regulators that had become second nature. But something in the chief's eyes told me this wasn't a drill. I grabbed my diving suit. The heavy canvas and rubber construction that would be my lifeline in whatever mission lay ahead. The weight of it in my arms felt different that morning, heavier somehow, as if it already carried the burden of what was to come. "What's the situation, Chief?" I asked, pulling on my boots with practiced efficiency. "We've got a live one." "In the harbor," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Soviet device, attached to the hull of the USS Randolph. Intelligence suggests it's been there for at least 6 hours, maybe more." The blood drained from my face. The Randolph was one of our most important aircraft carriers, home to over 3,000 souls. If something happened to her... The walk to the diving station felt like a death march. Other sailors we passed seemed to sense something was wrong. Conversations died mid-sentence, and I caught more than one man crossing himself as we hurried by. The October air was crisp, carrying the salt smell of the Chesapeake Bay mixed with diesel fuel, and the metallic scent that seemed to cling to everything on base. Captain Morrison was waiting for us at the dive platform, his weathered face grim with worry. At 55, he'd seen action in Korea and had the steady nerves that came with command, but even he couldn't hide his concern. "Henderson, I won't lie to you, this is as dangerous as it gets. Our sonar picked up the device an hour ago. It's magnetic, attached about 20 feet below the waterline on the starboard side." My hands were already moving, checking my equipment with the methodical precision drilled into me during training. Air tanks full, regulator functioning, dive knife sharp and secure. But my mind was racing. Underwater bomb disposal was the most dangerous job in the Navy, and everyone knew it. The water added complexity to everything: limited visibility, pressure changes, the constant threat of nitrogen narcosis clouding your judgment when you needed it most. "What do we know about the timer?" I asked, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. Inside, my heart was hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. Morrison exchanged a glance with Martinez before answering. "That's the problem, son. We don't know. Could be minutes, could be hours. But given how long it's likely been there, we have to assume we're working against the clock." He placed a hand on my shoulder, and I could feel the weight of command. In that gesture, "I know this is asking a lot, Henderson. But you're the best we've got. The best we've got." Those words would echo in my mind for decades to come. At 22, I felt anything but qualified for what lay ahead. I'd trained for this scenario countless times in controlled conditions, in swimming pools and calm training waters. But this was real. This was a live Soviet explosive device that could detonate at any moment, potentially killing thousands and crippling one of America's most important naval assets. As I suited up, pulling the heavy diving helmet over my head and checking the communication lines, I caught sight of my reflection in the dive station's window. The young man looking back at me seemed too young, too uncertain for the task ahead, but there was no one else. In that moment, I understood what it truly meant to serve, not just your country, but the men who depended on you to do the impossible. When everything was on the line, the water of Norfolk Harbor was murky that morning, visibility limited to maybe 10 feet even with the diving lights. As I descended toward the massive hull of the USS Randolph, the weight of the water above me seemed to press down with more than just physical force. Somewhere in the darkness below, a timer was counting down to catastrophe, and I was the only thing standing between that bomb and disaster. The water closed over my helmet with that familiar rushing sound that every Navy diver knows part. Embrace, part threat. At 20 feet below the surface, the world transformed into something alien and hostile. The massive steel hull of the USS Randolph loomed before me like a sleeping giant, dark metal surface disappearing into the murky depths of Norfolk Harbor. My breathing echoed inside the diving helmet, each exhale a reminder of my mortality. The communication line crackled to life as Chief Martinez's voice reached me from the surface. "Henderson, you're looking good down there. Can you see the hull clearly?" I adjusted my position, using small kicks to maintain neutral buoyancy as I approached the carrier's starboard side. "Affirmative, Chief. Moving along the hull now." My voice sounded strange to my own ears, distorted by the helmet speakers. The water here was contaminated with oil and debris, typical for a military harbor, and visibility was worse than I'd hoped. My diving light cut through the gloom, revealing patches of the ship's hull covered in marine growth, and the occasional school of fish that seemed oblivious to the danger lurking nearby. I'd been swimming along the hull for maybe 5 minutes when I saw it. The device stood out against the steel like a malignant growth, a cylindrical object about 3 feet long, held against the ship's hull by powerful magnets. Even through the murky water, I could see the ominous red light blinking at regular intervals. The timer. "Contact," I reported, my voice tight with tension. "I've got visual on the device." Cylindrical, approximately 3 feet in length, magnetically attached. I can see an active timer display. The silence from the surface stretched on for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only seconds. Captain Morrison's voice came through the communication line, steady but urgent. "What does the timer show, Henderson?" I maneuvered closer, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone on the surface could hear it through the comm system. The device was more sophisticated than anything we'd encountered in training, Jovid engineering it, its finest and most deadly. The timer display showed numbers that made my blood run cold. 12 minutes, 43 seconds, sir, and counting down. The words hung in the water around me like a death sentence. 12 minutes to either save the USS Randolph and her crew, or become part of the largest peacetime naval disaster in American history. I could hear urgent voices on the surface, though they'd switched to a different channel to keep their panic from reaching me. Smart move. The last thing I needed was to hear their fear when I was fighting to control my own. I circled the device carefully, looking for any external wires or triggers that might indicate a tamper switch. The Soviets were known for their clever engineering, and I couldn't afford to assume this was a simple, timer-based explosive. The magnetic attachment system was robust. 4 powerful electromagnets held the device firmly against the hull. Even with the ship's gentle movement in the harbor, the bomb remained perfectly stable. "Henderson, what's your assessment?" Martinez's voice cut through my concentration. "It's a sophisticated device, Chief. 4-point magnetic attachment, integrated timer system. I don't see any obvious external triggers, but I need to examine the casing more closely before I attempt removal." As I spoke, I was already reaching for my tools. The Navy had equipped me with a specialized kit for exactly this situation: wire cutters, electronic probes, and a small but powerful electromagnetic pulse device that could potentially disable the timer mechanism. The water around me seemed to grow colder as I worked. 10 minutes, 15 seconds. Each tick of that timer represented another step closer to catastrophe. I'd trained for this scenario countless times, but training never included the crushing weight of knowing that failure meant death, not just for me, but for thousands of innocent sailors sleeping in their bunks just feet above my head. I began my examination of the device's construction, looking for access panels or obvious weak points. The casing was seamless except for a small inspection hatch near the timer display. Through the murky water, I could just make out Cyrillic markings, definitely Soviet construction. There was something else, something that made my breath catch in my throat. A secondary device, smaller and attached to the main bomb with a thin wire, a motion sensor. If I moved the primary device without first disabling this secondary system, it would trigger immediately, regardless of the timer. The Soviets hadn't just built a bomb, they'd built a trap specifically designed to kill anyone trying to defuse it. Slowly, millimeter by millimeter, I repositioned myself to get a better angle on the wires. Each movement had to be deliberate and gradual, staying within the parameters that the sensor would consider normal water movement. It was like defusing a bomb while walking a tightrope. Every action balanced on the knife's edge between success and catastrophe. I made my decision. The green wire, the one connected to the backup power source. If I was right, cutting it would disable the backup systems without triggering the primary detonation circuit. If I was wrong, well, I wouldn't be around long enough to regret the mistake. The wire cutters felt impossibly heavy in my hands as I positioned them around the green wire. Through the murky water, I could see the timer continuing its relentless countdown. 3 minutes, 12 seconds. Somewhere above me, Captain Morrison and Chief Martinez were probably holding their breath, waiting for word that would either save the day or confirm their worst fears. I squeezed the cutters. The green wire parted with a tiny spark that was immediately absorbed by the salt water. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The timer continued counting down, the red light continued blinking, and my heart continued hammering against my ribs. But the motion sensor's indicator light, barely visible in the gloom, flickered once and went dark. "Motion sensor disabled," I reported, barely believing the words myself. Proceeding to remove the primary device, but even with the motion sensor neutralized, I still had to deal with the timer itself. 2 minutes 58 seconds. Removing the magnetic attachments would take at least 30 seconds, and then I'd need to swim the device away from the ship to a safe distance. So that left barely 2 minutes to figure out how to stop the countdown permanently. I activated the electromagnetic pulse device from my kit, a tool designed to disrupt electronic systems. It was a desperate gambit. The EMP might stop the timer, or it might trigger an immediate detonation. But with less than 3 minutes remaining, desperate measures were my only option. The EMP device charged with a high-pitched whine that I could feel through the water. I positioned it as close to the timer mechanism as I dared, said a quick prayer to whatever deity might be listening to Navy divers in over their heads. Zin bided the pulse. The effect was immediate and terrifying. Every electronic device within 20 feet went dead. My diving lights, my communication system, even the electronic depth gauge on my wrist. The water around me plunged into absolute darkness, broken only by the dim emergency light built into my helmet. But most importantly, the timer's red light had gone dark. In the sudden silence, broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the distant rumble of the ship's engines, I began the delicate process of removing the magnetic attachments. Each electromagnet had to be carefully disconnected from its power source, a process that would normally take 5 minutes, but which I completed in 90 seconds through sheer desperation and adrenaline. Finally, the device came free from the hole. I grabbed it carefully, acutely aware that despite the EMP pulse, there might still be backup systems I hadn't accounted for. Swimming as fast as I dared while carrying a potentially live explosive device, I moved away from the USS Randolph toward the designated safe area at the far end of the harbor. By the time I reached the surface, my air supply was nearly exhausted, and my entire body was shaking from the combination of cold water and pure terror. Chief Martinez and a team of divers were waiting for me, ready to take possession of the device and get me back to safety.
"Is it over?"
Martinez asked, as they hauled me onto the dive platform. I looked back at the USS Randolph floating peacefully. In the harbor, with her crew safe and unaware of how close they'd come to disaster, the device that had threatened to kill them all was now safely in the hands of the bomb disposal team, its timer dark and silent. "It's over, Chief," I said, finally allowing myself to believe it. It's over. But even now, 62 years later, I still wake up some nights hearing that timer counting down, still feeling the weight of those 3 wires in my hands and the terrible responsibility of choosing correctly. That day in Norfolk Harbor taught me what it really means to serve, not just your country, but the moment when everything depends on your ability to stay calm and make the right choice when failure isn't an option. The bomb never did explode. Our analysis later showed that the EMP had indeed disabled the timing mechanism permanently. But in my dreams, Sometimes it's still ticking, counting down to a moment that will never come. A reminder of the day a 22-year-old sailor held. The lives of 3,000 men in his hands and somehow managed not to let them slip away. 9 minutes, 28 seconds. And now I understood that this wasn't just about stopping a timer. I was engaged in a deadly chess match with an enemy I'd never met. Soviet engineer who had anticipated exactly what I would try to do. Every move I made from this point forward would need to be perfect, because even the slightest mistake would end not just my life, but the lives of everyone depending on me to succeed. 8 minutes, 47 seconds. The secondary device stared back at me through the murky water like a malevolent eye, its small sensor array designed to detect even the slightest movement of the primary bomb. Whoever had designed this system understood Navy bomb disposal protocols perfectly. They knew we'd try to remove the device from the hole, and they'd planned accordingly. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the electronic probe in my kit. The water magnified every small movement, making precise work nearly impossible. I had to steady myself against the hull of the USS Randolph, feeling the gentle vibration of the massive ship's systems through the steel. Somewhere above me, 3,000 sailors were going about their daily routines, unaware that their lives hung. In the balance, 20 feet below the waterline. Henderson, talk to me. What's your status down there? Chief Martinez's voice crackled through the communication system, tense with barely controlled anxiety. I've identified a secondary triggering mechanism, Chief. Motion sensor linked to the primary device. If I attempt to remove the bomb without disabling this first, it'll detonate immediately. I kept my voice as steady as possible, but I could hear the strain in my own words. 7 minutes, 32 seconds. The silence from the surface stretched on for long seconds before Captain Morrison's voice came through the line. Can you disable the secondary device? That was the million-dollar question. I examined the small sensor unit more closely, using the diving light to illuminate its construction. It was a marvel of miniaturization. Soviet engineers had packed sophisticated electronics into a package no larger than a cigarette pack. But sophistication also meant complexity, and complexity meant more ways for things to go wrong. The sensor was connected to the main device by a single thin wire. But cutting that wire might trigger the bomb just as surely as moving it. Instead, I needed to understand how the system worked. I activated my electronic probe, designed to detect electrical current without making direct contact. The readings were immediate and terrifying. The sensor was actively monitoring its position relative to the ship's hull, using a combination of magnetic field detection and physical motion sensing. It was calibrated so precisely that even the gentle movement of the ship in the harbor was within acceptable parameters. But any attempt to move the bomb more than a few inches in any direction would trigger an immediate detonation. 6 minutes. 18 seconds. I forced myself to breathe slowly and think methodically. In training, they'd taught us that panic was the enemy of precision, and precision was the only thing that kept explosive ordnance disposal specialists alive. But this was beyond anything we'd trained for. This was improvisation at the deepest level, making life-or-death decisions with incomplete information and no time for second-guessing. I'm going to attempt to bypass the motion sensor, I reported. It'll require accessing the internal electronics, but I think I can fool the system into believing the device hasn't moved. Negative, Henderson. Morrison's voice was firm. Risky. We're evacuating the Randolph now. Get back to the surface, sir. With respect, there isn't time. Even if you could evacuate 3,000 men in 6 minutes, the explosion would cripple the ship and potentially damage other vessels in the harbor. I have to try. The silence from above told me everything I needed to know. They understood as well as I did that evacuation wasn't really an option, not with 6 minutes left on the timer. I reached for my smallest screwdriver, designed for delicate electronic work. The motion sensor's casing had a tiny access panel secured with equally tiny screws. Working underwater, with limited visibility, and the constant pressure of time running out, removing those screws was like performing surgery while wearing boxing gloves. 5 minutes, 45 seconds. The first screw came free, floating away into the murky water. The second one fought me, its threads corroded by saltwater exposure. I could feel sweat building up inside my diving helmet, despite the cold water surrounding me. Finally, the screw yielded. I was able to access the sensor's internal electronics. What I found inside was both encouraging and terrifying. The motion detection system was more sophisticated than I'd hoped, but it was also more vulnerable. The key component was a small gyroscope that monitored the device's orientation. If I could disconnect the gyroscope without triggering the backup systems, the sensor would effectively become blind to movement, but there were 3 wires leading to the gyroscope. I had no way of knowing which one was the primary signal, and which were backups or triggers. Cut the wrong wire, and the bomb would detonate instantly. Choose correctly, and I might be able to move the device safely away from the ship. For minutes. 28 seconds. I stared at those 3 wires. Red, blue, and green, knowing that my choice would determine whether I lived to see another sunrise. In that moment, suspended 20 feet underwater with a Soviet bomb inches from my face, I thought about my training, my family back home in Ohio, and the thousands of sailors whose lives depended on my next decision. Time seemed to slow as I reached for the wire cutters, my hands steady, despite the magnitude of the moment. Red, blue, or green. One would save us all. The other 2 would end everything in a flash of fire and destruction that would be felt throughout Norfolk Harbor. 4 minutes, 28 seconds. 3 wires, red, blue, green. In all my training, no instructor had ever prepared me for this moment, the absolute solitude of making a decision that would determine whether thousands of people lived or died. The water around me seemed to press in from all sides, as if the entire weight of the Chesapeake Bay was focused on this single moment of choice. I forced myself to think systematically, the way Chief Instructor Williams had taught us back at EOD school in Indian Head, Maryland. When you don't know the answer, he'd said, look for clues in the construction. Engineers think logically, even enemy engineers. I examined the wire routing more carefully, tracing each connection with my diving light. The red wire ran directly to the gyroscope's power supply. That much was clear from its thickness and the direct path it took. The blue wire was thinner, likely a signal wire carrying data from the gyroscope to the main detonation circuit. But the green wire was the puzzle. It didn't connect directly to the gyroscope at all. Instead, it ran to a small component I hadn't noticed before, something that looked like a backup power source. Henderson, for minutes remaining, Martinez's voice cut through my concentration. I could hear the strain in every word, the weight of command bearing down on him as surely as the water pressure was bearing down on me. Copy that, Chief. I'm proceeding with disarmament of the motion sensor. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. Inside my diving helmet, sweat was beginning to fog my faceplate despite the cold water. I reached up to adjust the ventilation system, a motion that had become automatic after 2 years of diving. But my hand froze halfway to the valve movement. The motion sensor would detect any significant movement, including my own. I'd been so focused on the device itself that I'd forgotten the most basic rule. The sensor was watching everything within its range, including me. Any sudden motion, even adjusting my equipment, might trigger the detonation sequence. 3 minutes, 45 seconds.